Let's remind you of our top story today. The independent inquiry into the crimes of a necrophiliac double murderer has called for urgent regulation of the funeral sector. David Fuller is one of Britain's most prolific sex offenders, and he used his job as a hospital maintenance worker to access mortuaries where he sexually abused dead bodies. Now, the chair of the inquiry set up following the case has urged the government to introduce better safeguards. Our Home Editor, Jason Farrell, joins me now. And Jason, it is just astonishing to most that there aren't safeguards and regulations in place from the government already.
Yeah, that's right. That's one of the points that Sir Jonathan Michael makes, is that he thinks the public will be shocked to learn that this regulation isn't in place. There is a trade body that regulates 70% of funeral parlours, but two problems with that. One is it's not independent, it is a trade body, and secondly, nobody has to join it. So currently 30% of funeral parlours are not regulated. And this inquiry, let's remember, was set up to look at the crimes of David Fuller and how he was able to rape and sexually assault the bodies of women, over 100, in Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells NHS Trust Hospital. And the fact that he was able to get away with that for so long was the first thing that the inquiry looked into and saw all sorts of mistakes that it uncovered. But then it decided to broaden out to look at whether this was possible to happen in other places. What were the regulations around bodies being stored in funeral parlours, for example. And Sir Jonathan Michael was so concerned about this that he decided to bring this report out early. Here's what he had to say.
I would assume that the majority of funeral directors are providing good quality care to the deceased. But the reality is, in the present situation, anybody could become a funeral director. And the reality is anybody could become a funeral director, set up their business in their own home, care for the deceased in their own garage, and nobody has any ability to prevent them doing that. There is no legal or regulatory arrangement which would stop them doing that. Now, that just can't be right. The key thing is for the government to introduce some statutory regulation for funeral directors, and I think that needs to be done as soon as possible. That needs to include agreed standards, some sort of licensing and inspection regime, some system that actually identifies the minimum quality or qualifications of staff that are working in the funeral director sector, and it also needs to include information that should be provided by the funeral sector to their customers, because we also found that people really didn't understand how the services were being delivered.
Well, the inquiry heard all sorts of examples of malpractice. I mean, they did say the majority of funeral parlours were performing well, but examples included bodies not being stored correctly, rubbish being put in coffins, someone being spat at, a body being spat at because they supported the wrong team. And then there's been media reports, of course, Nigel Robinson-Wright from Blackpool, who ran a funeral parlour there, he actually posed with naked bodies and invited someone over to have sex with a corpse. He was jailed for 25 years. So some horrific examples, and obviously the worst of them is David Fuller and what he did in those hospitals in Kent. And I spoke to the mother of one of his victims, the victim Azra Kamal, and the mother Nevres Kamal. Here's what she had to say to these latest findings.
Well, I'm completely shocked. Completely. I've used the funeral parlour 3 times for family relatives, and I presumed that they would be regulated. But I go back to the point which I made some months and years back. No one cares about the dead. So I'm sure there will be regulatory policies put in place. It will be interesting to see what they are, what is the criteria, who can work in there.
Well, those are the questions, really. How should these various funeral parlours be regulated? What sort of regulation? Who should be allowed to run funeral parlours? They're all questions for the government as to what regulation they bring in. They haven't indicated yet what they will do, but in a ministerial statement from the Department of Health, they said the government is committed to preventing any similar atrocities happening again and ensuring the deceased are safeguarded and treated with dignity.